draft debate is fascinating to me because I didn't even know that every 18-year-old boy has to register and they could be fined or go to jail. I mean, I just didn't know. And it is wrong. But I think what's wrong about it is having a draft. I don't necessarily think we should have women registering. Or do you think women should?
Well, that's an interesting question. Within the men's rights movement, we disagree on whether there should or shouldn't be a draft. The more conservative MRAs, as we call ourselves often, believe there should be a draft and that women should be drafted even if they're not drafted into combat roles. They should. Conservatives among us often say women can still be required to register and share the same responsibility even if they're not put in combat. They can have other kind of roles they're drafted into. The more, I would say, liberal or left-leaning MRAs tend to not believe there should be a draft at all, or that if there is, women should be drafted into combat. It really, we have varying opinions among us. As far as myself, I don't think there should be a draft. I think it violates human rights. But I guess I can see the argument that we need one. I don't agree with it, but it's not one that I refuse to at least understand. The position why we need one is, of course, that if there's a war, we may not have enough ground troops, so we need to force people into it. I think the very fact that we have had a draft historically shows that men are not all that gung-ho about jumping into combat like we like to think they are. Certainly there are a lot of men who are, but there are a lot of men who are not. And if they were all just, dying to go into combat and war, we wouldn't have needed a draft to begin with. In fact, men protested. There were the draft riots in New York, as you see in the movie, the Gangs of New York with Leonardo DiCaprio. They show those draft riots. And they really did happen. Men did, particularly low-income men, rioted against it. So, the draft is very interesting. Very interesting.
I've heard from a few MRAs that they say, I didn't get the right to vote. I earned the right to vote by registering for the draft. You get to vote as being a woman. Is that true? You register and that's how you earn your right to vote?
To be honest, I'm not familiar with any law that says you aren't able to vote if you're not registered for the draft. I know that if you don't register for the draft, you can be barred from receiving federal grants, student loans, and having certain federal jobs. I know men who've been fired because as adults in their 40s. Even one who was homeless for many years during his draft age and didn't register during those years, and suddenly when they find out after he's served with the federal government for 20 or 30 years, then they suddenly fire him. I've seen those cases. They can, of course, go to jail. So I know about that, but as far as it being connected to the right to vote, I haven't heard of that. It may be, but I haven't heard that at all. So I'm not sure that I would agree that that's true. I guess you could make the philosophical argument. I think it does make sense. I mean, that the position that we hear so often about women's right to vote and how they weren't allowed to vote, but we don't hear much about how males are forced to register their bodies for conscription and that thousands and hundreds of thousands, in fact, have been conscripted. I don't know what the actual number is. But the Vietnam Memorial has 68,000 names, and about 8 of them are female. I mean, there's definitely a disparity there. Not all of those are forced conscripts, and you could be a conscientious objector, but that carried a lot of stigma. So, I mean, I think that the military draft, forcing people to fight in war, is one of the worst forms of forced labor that there is. And we just don't talk about that for some reason in academia or in the media or in the government when we talk about gender discrimination and its history. For some reason, those things don't really come up. It's always about women's right to vote and other things that relate to women, but never about fathers, battered men, forced military conscription, even in some countries, retirement ages. In Israel, women are allowed to retire at much younger ages. I believe there's discrimination against women too, but there's no reason that we can't talk about both. The men's rights movement in Israel a few years ago got the United Nations Human Rights Court to chastise Israel for its tender years doctrine, which is gender specific, and says that in the younger years women should automatically get custody. A similar thing happened in Europe when men's rights activists in Germany got the European Union Human Rights Court to stop Germany from enforcing its law that said unmarried fathers have no custody rights unless the mom consents to it. So recently, even though it has not been in the mass media in the United States, we have seen international human rights courts finally addressing men's rights. And I think that that needs to increase. And I think that the media should have covered that. I believe if those were changes to women's rights, with the countries were denying women those rights and the human rights courts told them to change, it would have been all over the American media and we would all know about it. I think that because it's the other way around, they just don't cover it for various reasons. Like I'm sure a lot of them would say, the majority of people in government are men, so the men made these rules against their own selves. So it's not as, I guess it may not make as interesting a story. And my response to that again is it's still discrimination. If I were in court and I had representing a male client and the judge who was male and said, well, I'm sorry, but because he's male, I'm going to give him a higher sentence, and I mean, was assuming he was honest about it, I can't imagine telling the judge, well, Your Honor, I would object to this as sex discrimination, but since you're male, it's not, so I would withhold my objection. It is still sex discrimination. It doesn't matter. But that is one of the things that serves as a barrier to our thought process, I think. Just everything we hear, the whole history, and men being mostly the ones in positions of power makes us think that there can't be any significant discrimination against men, and if it is, it's all men's fault anyway. So we don't talk about it.
It's conditioning. It's kind of brainwashing.
I think it is. And I think it is a form of brainwashing, yeah. I mean, depending on how you define brainwashing. But I certainly agree with you that it is at minimum conditioning, social conditioning. I happen to think it serves women to address men's rights. I think it serves women's rights to address men's and women's rights because they both come from gender roles and gender expectations. And the more you alleviate one, I think you also help alleviate the other. So I don't see why we can't have that dialogue. It should not be zero-sum. There's discrimination going both ways. And there's no reason why we can't address it that way. But for some reason, it just takes a very, very long time to get that kind of balanced dialogue going.